Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to another Ummatics Colloquium with myself, Dr. Osama Al Azmi. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome my colleague, Dr. Adil Malik, who will be speaking from the University of Oxford. I just want to briefly introduce today's theme. The topic is the prospects for Ummatic economic unity. Islamic economics is a relatively young field of inquiry, and one that does not garner the kind of attention that more popular arenas of Islamic scholarly inquiry tend to gain, be they the topics of Islamic law or contemporary Islamic political concerns, which both tend to hold the attention of the traditional ulama and the Muslim masses respectively. Yet the importance of Islamic economics as a field is underlined by the fact that the field of economics is one of the central domains of the current global order, a major arena of global superpower contention and contestation. The economic structures within which we live and work affect every single human being on Earth for good and often for ill. As the economic anthropologist Jason Hickel has observed, economics is one of the arenas in which global domination of the global south, and this of course includes much of the Muslim world, is often sustained, notwithstanding small exceptions to this general rule. Furthermore, the economic systems within which humans live are at their foundation a reflection of the ideology of the hegemonic powers of the global order. At the moment, in economic terms, this primarily means that the ideological outlooks of the United States and the G7 define what the global economic order looks like. And although this domination is now being contested by the BRICS bloc, there is currently no meaningful or effective bloc of Muslim or Islamic states, notwithstanding the long-standing existence of the OIC. In this context, Muslims need to think about how their own traditions, philosophies, and political theologies could offer the ideological foundations for an alternative model of Ummatic economics, one that reflects Islamic values, but additionally one that contributes to the greater integration of the Ummah on a global scale, and crucially, one that brings a greater economic prosperity and spiritual flourishing within its territories. It is in this backdrop that I have the immense pleasure of inviting my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Adil Malik, to speak with us on the prospects for Ummatic economic unity. Dr. Malik is a Globe Fellow in Economics or in Economies of Muslim Societies and Associate Professor at the University of Oxford. Professor Malik is a development macroeconomist with a strong multidisciplinary orientation. His research focuses on long-run development, political economy, and economic history, with a special emphasis on Muslim societies. Combining quantitative and qualitative research methods, he engages in cross-country empirical studies on development. Notably, his recent article, The Economics of the Arab Spring, received the Best Paper Award and has been translated into Arabic and other languages, gaining recognition in The Economist magazine. Dr. Malik has also explores the interplay between religion, land, and politics in Pakistan as part of the IFPRI funded project, and he holds the Globe Fellow in Economics in the Economies of Muslim Societies at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies, and serves as the associate editor of the Palgrave Dictionary of Economics. I could go on, but with that, I want to just first say that this is being live streamed, and so we welcome questions from the audience in the various platforms that we are broadcasting on, and we will try to address these questions in the latter half of today's broadcast. But with that, I welcome Adil to speak. Prospects for Ummatic economic unity.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to join this forum. Let me thank Osama and Ummatics for this kind invitation, and I would like to throw in a few uh, clarifications before I start. Let me tell my friends that I'm not a religiously trained scholar, so please forgive me if I'm making any mistakes. I am a social scientist and economist by training, with a deep interest in political economy and in moral economy. and I'm a great believer in exploring the moral economy of Islam through a variety of different lens. I think we need greater integration of the religious sciences as well as the economic sciences to get a feel for the broader moral economy of Islam. But I do, as a humble believer, I do appreciate the constant advice and instruction in the Quran and in religious discourses in general to engage in tafakkar, to think about these different ideas, to constantly recover them. Now, the topic of our presentation today is to look at the prospects for economic integration across the Muslim societies. A lot of people have written about it. We know for a fact that Muslim societies are not very well integrated. They are hugely fragmented. And a key illustration of this is Arab economies themselves that have one of the lowest shares of inter-regional trade. People have also worked on, lower trade amongst OIC member states. But I actually want to start the discussion today with a historical inquiry, which I think is extremely important if we were to think about the importance of economy for the larger moral framework of Islam. And I want to take you through 14 slides. And these slides are part of a forthcoming chapter in a book on Islamic finance, um, where I started thinking about the moral economy of Islam. And this it was more like a personal journey because, as a child, you come across the history of Islam and you absorb a lot of information without necessarily understanding the larger philosophical spirit behind those historical episodes. I think what was really interesting for me was to go back to the advent of Islam, to the rise of Islam, and to refresh my memory and refresh the history of whatever we were taught in childhood days as a political economist, because now I was reading this history after having taught political economy at Oxford for about 17 years. And to my surprise, I discovered many interesting new facets of the early Islamic experience that highlighted the centrality of economics to the experience of Islam, and the centrality of what I call the economics of solidarity, the ability to create a larger human solidarity based on monotheism, which served as a code of economic and civilizational exchange. Whilst that form of economic solidarity firstly concerned Muslim societies and Muslim communities, it effectively provides us a template for human bonding, a template for human integration at a very larger scale. Um, and I think these 14 slides provide you some provocative material to think about the centrality of this economics of solidarity. And on that basis, then I'm going to make a few claims about the integration of Muslim economies in the present period. So, with your permission, Osama, if I could share the slides. Um, I don't know if you can see the slides now on my screen.
We can see them clearly, alhamdulillah.
So these 14 slides are an attempt of a rather uninitiated sort of a scholar who is very humble about his understanding of Islam, but is really making an effort to understand as a social scientist, um, the larger frame of moral economy that becomes evident to us through the Islamic experience. And when I looked at some of these earlier materials, I realized that um, the leitmotif of Islamic moral economy is circulation. And we often think of circulation usually in, the sort of figure on the right where you could see, whirling dervishes. There's a movement around that. It's a very symbolic movement. But actually, you can think of circulation as an interconnectedness, as a key part of not just economic exchange but the very divine order. And two aspects of this circulatory exchange, in my opinion, are central. The first is a visible element where we are trading with somebody, right? So we are exchanging goods and services with somebody else. That's a very visible form of trade because we know who we are buying and selling with. There is another aspect of trade which is invisible, and that's the trade with God. That's a trade with with God on the other hand, because charity is that exchange that where the door when it opens, God is on the other end, but he's not visible. So that is the invisible domain of exchange, and that's charity. And together, these two aspects, trade and charity, in my opinion, are absolutely central for the thinking about the moral economy of Islam. And in fact, trade is so central, and obviously, trade would be crucial when we think about integration amongst Muslim societies because they trade very little at the moment. But I sometimes feel trade is almost like the currency of Islam. It's so central. It's like we have, many of these pillars like Hajj and Salat and Zakat, and a whole range of, faraid that we have. The centrality of trade is really paramount. Now, such is the importance of circulation and the importance of the market as a very divine instrument that um, in many historical traditions, this is a tradition that I'm basically highlighting from the Damascus Suq al-Hamadiyya. But in principle, you go to any part of the Muslim world, you'll find Muslim traders who start their day by being willing to forego profit, and they are just um, willing to create more liquidity even in lean periods. They say, well, it's important for us not to block the flow of goods and services. um, and so because they always thought we are sitting in the middle of a divinely sanctioned chain of circulation, and even in periods when we are not making profit, we must not stop the flow of goods and services. So there's always that sense that this circulation of goods and services is not just a material circulation, it's a circulation that sustains livelihoods. It's a circulation that's part of a divine chain. Now, when I looked at the history of the rise of Islam, many things dawned on me as a political economist. The first thing that came to that I understood better through a rereading of that history was the manner in which Islam came and on top of a series of institutional innovations. And monotheism was that final lid that opened the door for larger and larger exchange. So, to explain that, uh, let us go back to the very idea of the sanctity of trade in Mecca, which is the notion of haram, because it designated the time and area where the life and property of all those who were visiting Mecca was actually safe. And so haram was effectively an institution that created safety and security of trade, movement of people and goods, converted Makkah into a sanctuary. It's a place where you can feel safe. And obviously, if you go all the way back to Adam Smith or even to Ibn Khaldun, you know, economists, social scientists, sociologists, they've always been concerned with the creation of social order and the way trade is important for the creation of that social order and for peace and justice. Now, the emergence of Makkah as that uh, place of safety and security prepared it for a series of institutional innovations in pre Islamic Arabia. Prior to the advent of Islam, this was a period when raiding and robbery of trade caravans was common, right? There was no safety and security per se. Um, in this context, obviously, Haram offered a regime for security and solidarity. And it set the stage for a series of incremental institutional innovations that shifted the equilibrium in Mecca from a raiding robbery based equilibrium where different tribes on the margins of Mecca would survive by raiding other people and raiding caravans to an equilibrium which is more cooperative and where people would participate to become part of a larger trading enterprise. To understand this institutional innovation, we first need to go back to Qusay ibn Kilab, who was the leader of one of the most powerful tribes of Mecca, the Quraysh that you all know. And he institutionalized a number of practices which were to set the stage for a powerful trading equilibrium. The first was Hilf. This was really solidarity induced trade. You create alliances with different tribes, allow the security of passage of goods, but again, this alliance is still very much amongst different tribes. Then you have Rifada, feeding the victims, Sakaya, providing water, Sadaqah, you're providing voluntary alms for the needy. So you could see that there's a beginning of the emergence of a new solidarity, which is based on trade and social justice. And the confluence of the two is very important because obviously with trade comes new inequalities and you need to address many of these inequalities through explicit instruments of social justice. Now, from the hilf, we then have what we call the economy of the elaf. It's the first time that I truly understood what really elaf meant. And elaf really shifted the equilibrium from hilf, which was more based on tribal alliances, to a new equilibrium. And this was really pioneered by Qusay's grandson Hashim ibn Abd al-Manaf, who made two further institutional innovations that radically changed the fortunes of Mecca. First, he made trade financing participatory, which meant that even poorer merchants with less money can participate in long distance trade. You can contribute as per your strength. And then you moved from a negotiated security of trade to the expansion of the scale of trade in the market access. And it's because Qusay's grandson Hashim ibn al-Manaf went all the way to Syria and spoke with the Syrian merchants and Syrian figures of influence and said, look, we come to you, we bring trade caravans, you provide us security. In return, we can take your goods to all those market fairs that we visit. So this was very different from health. This was really transformative because it was not just saying we protect your goods, you protect our goods, or we give each other negotiated package passages. No, no, no. This was great saying we come to you, you provide us security, and we will take your goods to the markets that we frequent, all those market fairs. And lo and behold, the Syrians agreed. Now, this was such a massive innovation because it effectively increased the scale of trade and provided market access to the Syrian merchants in an unprecedented fashion. Because wherever the Meccans were going, they were taking their goods along. And who was profiting? The Syrian merchants themselves were profiting. And it became such an important instrument that other tribes came to the Quraysh and said, we want the same deal as the Syrians. We want you to take our goods as well wherever you are going. And in a way, although it's an oversimplification perhaps, but it seems to me that the Ilaf were modern day versions of regional trade agreements. Right? They provided a new framework for economic cooperation. They expanded the scale of trade. They provided market access. They created larger economic solidarity between disparate tribes and gradually helped to shift the equilibrium from a focus on low level extraction, robbery, raiding, or maybe some negotiated passages, to actually cooperation to increase the scale of trade together where everybody can be a beneficiary. That was truly remarkable. And this obviously expansion of trade create new economic opportunities, but it also created social imbalances within Makkah's tribal order because there was going to be now concentration of economic power. There were some merchants extremely powerful, a lot of money coming in. There's a lot of surplus money to be lent out to other people, so new lending market, more demand for labor. So you have a growing presence of slaves and client laborers, often known as mawali. Um, and the transition from collective leadership to a clan-based competition, because obviously Mecca's polity at that time was increasingly factionalized and socially differentiated. So this was the time when you find that although the Ilaf had expanded the scope of trade, um, it could, the original institutional order prior to the advent of Islam, which was very much based on tribal benevolence, was unable to handle the social imbalances that were being brought about due to this expansion of the economic frontier. And of course, there was the element of power. A lot of the wealthy merchants in Mecca controlled its religious symbols. That's the time when I understood that actually this whole polytheistic order was not just about worshipping those idols, but there's an entire political economy surrounding around it. Who controls those symbols? Control the market, the control resources, control the economic power in that sphere. Um, and so a lot of these tensions were could not be solved uh, by Makkah's tribal order. And of course, there was Rifada and Sekaya and many other social welfare instruments, but they were being dispensed through tribal dispensation. This was an environment that was rife for a new idea, and that new idea was Islam. It was monotheism. It substituted the authority of the clan with the authority of God. And the protection of trade, the new trading equilibrium that had been generated through ELAF, and the promotion of charity were taken out of the realm of tribal benevolence and they were made accessible to all. So, what Douglas North talks about open access orders, this is really the beginnings of the creation of an open access institutional order. Now, market is central in this whole enterprise, the way Islam arrived, and the sort of success of Islam was the success of a new market and trading order. Um, but it all depends on the notions and the visions of the market that we have. It's not the sort of market that is emphasized in sort of mainstream discourses. We need to understand what we mean by the market. And to understand this, one of the very few articles by Joseph Schacht on on the market in Medina, which provides us some interesting clues about the way in which the Prophet um, set up is stamped in the middle of Medina, and he said, well, this is your market. Do not set up sections in it, and do not impose taxes for it. Right? It's basically for me as an economist, it's telling me, do not set up sections in it. It's basically saying you're not going to have a few individuals controlling the market who control different sections of the market. You don't fragment these different parts of the market. Now, this is important for us to understand because the Muslim world that is largely unintegrated economically is unintegrated because of an important reason, because different people have set up sections in it who control different parts of the market and do not impose taxes. It's not just any taxes, it's about basically undue exactions that you have to derive from it. And in principle, I see the Prophet highlighting two key aspects of the market here. There's the autonomy that the market should be autonomous from the undue influence of a few actors, and participation of everyone. Everyone can be part of the market. And that is why you find such centrality of the market exchange that wherever you go in the world, from the streets of Lahore to Marrakesh to the downtown in Singapore, you find old markets coexisting with mosques. They are central. The souk is central. The bazaar is central in Muslim moral, political imagination. And they obviously offer both moral and material produce. And this is indeed why the Prophet described the market as a charitable endowment, al suq al sadaqa, because it brings different communities together, creates relationships with them. They create more, mutually binding, reciprocal arrangements, and you become part of that divine order of circulation where different communities, different groups are interwoven in that chain of circulation. Now, for those of you who understand the rise of Islam and then its expansion later on, know about so many different histories about how with the conquest of Mecca, the power of the merchant class was consolidated. Um, it's significant that none of the assets or properties or wealth of these Meccan merchants were never expropriated. They were allowed to operate. Um, il, the spread of Islam through different parts of the world took place through long distance trade. Right? It was described as the central agent of Islamization. And there's so many examples. I mean, people have studied the Silk Road, the importance of the Hadrami merchants in East Asia, the rise of new trading networks in Indian Ocean, um, you know, land-based trade routes. If you look at the trans-Saharan trade routes, Lake Chad, Kano, Ethiopia, I mean, this is all interesting. These are interesting examples of those. Um, a central element in this new trading order was the Hajj, which again has a symbolic but a material significance as well, because it brought together people and goods, ideas, even the Sufi saints, the way they traveled. If you study the history of the Sanusi Sufi order, very strategically located on crucial trade and Hajj routes. Um, and they were always involved in agriculture, trading, commercial exchanges. Um, in Kashmir, you have very similar um, emphasis by Mir Sayyid Ali Hamdani, where he talked about, the kargah and the khanka, the craft workshops and the Sufi hospices. They were both parts, two uh, uh, interlinked domains. So the more you read about this stuff, the more you realize that actually, you know, the economics of solidarity, where people are connected with each other through a variety of different exchanges, is, it's an idea that is so fundamental to Islamic moral economy that I cannot think of any civilizational order, a revival of a new civilization order in Islam, or an economic order, or a political order without thinking about the question of how to create economic commons across the Muslim world. Those economic commons that will bring different communities together. Um, what I think the Islamic experience tells you is that it's kind of globalization before its time. Long before people like Fernand Braudel and Montesquieu extolled the virtues of trade as a cooperative device and mutual interdependence. Um, this was the creation of solidarity at scale. And that solidarity at scale is really really interesting experience. Um, I think what it also did um, was to create um, a view of the world that is not a zero sum view of the world, right? It's not just any trade where you are profiting. It's a form of trade where you feel that you are invested in other person's prosperity. You are invested in the other person. You are invested in the community. So it's not a zero-sum view of the world where you are gaining at the expense of somebody's loss. And there's a lot of social science work that's telling us about how important it is to produce social order, how important it is to solve the problem of violence. And economists typically talk about the increasing returns problem of the control of violence, because to control violence, you need a specialized economy. And to get a specialized economy, you need a reformed polity. And you cannot get one without the other. And if you look at the history of the evolution of Islam, it's really that gradual move from the hilf to the ilaf to that monotheistic order that is creating these new sets of relationship, which we are really important. The early Islamic trading experience obviously was one which had more embodied exchange. You are traveling, you're taking your goods, you're settling in other territories, you are marrying, you're forming relationships, you have mutually binding reciprocal obligations with communities. And so it's not just market versus the state, it's the creation of community, it's the creation of an entirely new lingua franca, right? Which is important. Now, all of this has huge contemporary relevance, because look at some of the key ills that we are facing today in the world. We have a toxic discourse on trade, right? It's the China US competition, it's the India China US competition, it's lots of different states competing for trading influence. Um, we are getting into deglobalization or reshoring, and all that sort of discourse on trade is really about a zero sum view of the world, where not everyone can win. If you are winning, somebody's losing. um, Another important scourge is xenophobic nationalism. We don't know how to deal with migrants and ethnic differences across the world. This is 21st century, but we have very huge difficulty within nations, even when Muslim countries. Um, you know, if Jordan gets more Syrian refugees, or uh, Lebanon gets more Syrian refugees, there's a problem of us versus the other. Or if there are more Afghanis come to Pakistan, there's always a problem about Afghanis coming in, without realizing the the centuries of coexistence, the centuries of trade that brought people and communities together. So that's the second key challenge we face today, is the kind of xenophobic nationalism. The third one is the existence of egregious inequalities. A spate of recent research has highlighted growing inequalities in Western countries, but also in many developing countries. So how do you really build social cohesion in the midst of these extreme disparities? And I think I mean, without trying to romanticize it too much, I don't want to do that, but I cannot also understate the importance of the early Islamic experience giving us a solution to all three contemporary challenges that we face today: toxic discourse on trade, xenophobic nationalism, egregious forms of inequality. And it happened because there was a different vision of the border at that time. The markets, trade, exchange between many different communities created a different type of social and political and economic order, right? If you go to this place, my favorite example, Man in Jordan, you have two signs: Man al Shamiyya, Man al Hijaziyya. These are two signs that are telling us signs of different types of circulation that sustained communities, their livelihoods, their relationship. And you could see that Man today is one of those places that is relatively poor, and it is also vulnerable to violence. It's also vulnerable to smuggling. It's vulnerable to all sorts of problems that the modern nation state tries to to address. And I'm gonna uh, skip, you know, some of these slides. I mean, one issue I want to leave with you is that, but it's less relevant for our discussion today. Is really new effort is needed to understand what usury is, and it's not just a lender and a borrower relationship. It's also a power proposition, and it's linked with the very idea of slavery and freedom. Um, but more to the point, I want to highlight that a lot of these ideas that have been highlighting, modern economic thinkers, development thinkers, are saying similar things in different ways. They've come down to that path in very similar ways. You know, when Mariana Mazzucato talks about value extraction versus value creation, that we need to have an economy that creates value rather than extracts, that is not just based on casino capitalism. Or when Raghuram Rajan says, you know, let's not just talk about the market and the state, let's talk about the third pillar, which is the community. Or when Paul Collier talks about why is capitalism failing? Well, we've lost our reciprocal obligations. Or when Colin Mayer talks about, you know, corporations needing to have some public purpose, or that there could be some stakeholder maximization. These are all ideas that are ideas about ethics and morals. And in fact, um, the famous Nobel Prize winner, Angus Deaton, in his recent article in Finance and Development, uh, provided an extensive critique of modern economics. And his second point was the importance of ethics, how important it is to think about larger ethical questions. So there is a lot in there in the early Islamic experience, which and I will unshare my screen for the moment. So there's a big sort of domain out there for us to explore in the early Islamic civilizational experience that is fit for us today. Now, all of that is past. What about the present? And I want to make a series of claims um, based on this in this presentation. I think all this talk about um, the community, the ummah, um, is incomplete, and it's frankly doesn't take us anywhere unless we talk about economic opportunities, economic integration, about trade, um, about creating a vision of the market where these communities are interlinked. Um, Based on the experience that I have accumulated over time, both in terms of trying to understand these questions from an Islamic standpoint, but also in modern day economics. The second, I think, submission I will make is that it's not without a reason that Muslim economies remain fragmented. Right? If I were to, let's say, just focus on a region that Osama and I have studied a little bit with the Arab Spring, right, the Arab areas, a lot of these Arab markets, to understand why they're fragmented, you have to understand how borders were made. What is the conception of the border? The modern nation state borders. I'm not saying those borders should go away, but why did those borders become thick economic borders? Right? So that's one. The other thing I would highlight is that a key reason why markets remain protected and unintegrated has to do with the privilege of actors who continue to benefit through closure of the markets. The, as markets remain closed, as these countries remain closed to the outside world, domestic protectionist lobbies benefit from that framework, right? Because they can thrive in the extra protection. They can enjoy monopolies. They can enjoy all sorts of rents by closing up those societies, economies. The second issue has to do with with politics, because from the perspective of every political dispensation in the Muslim world, if there is more integration with neighboring jurisdictions, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, they can be a potential threat because it creates new forms of economic power. And that new economic power creates new political challenges. Unless you can control the political effects of that new form of economic power, rulers would say we much rather survive without um, without economic integration. So there's a very strong political economy logic for the lack of integration. There's also a geopolitical logic because the more countries become integrated, the more difficult it becomes to control geopolitical outcomes. And if you're thinking about, let's say, the geopolitical order in the Middle East, that would look very different if all these countries have vibrant trade and economy and other types of connections that would allow the movement of goods, the movement of people, the movement of ideas that is that threatens domestic political order, that threatens geopolitical order. And so, while we may not recognize the importance of integrated markets, those who create dominant visions of geopolitical order really know what is the benefit of it. That's why many of the countries today cannot decide who to trade with, who to connect their infrastructure with. Right? If Pakistan wants to buy cheap gas energy from the neighboring Iran, not easy. It's going to be a problem. Or if you need to have a new kind of a connectivity infrastructure of oil, gas, whatever in the Arab world, there are all sorts of players who will come in and say, no, we cannot let you connect X with Y or Z. Um, and so you could see that this ultimately becomes a question of not just solidarity, it's a question of sovereignty as well, because many of the modern nation states do not have the power to make those decisions, because the global system recognizes very well that the moment you allow these natural organic linkages to be created, it will strengthen solidarity. It will create new forms of economic, political, symbolic power, and that can really challenge centralized power in many of these states. But in all of this, there is another thought that I want to present. There's a little trepidation in making that claim. But let me just put it for provocative reasons. Based on whatever I have explained today, it appears to me as a social scientist, and again, with all due humility, because I don't have that religious authority to make that claim, but I feel it's important for us to have those discussions. So, what's the claim? The claim that I feel that when we think about of the um, many of the crucial elements or pillars of our faith, such as Hajj, for example, it appears to me that from the perspective of the individual believer, it would be right to say they go to Mecca and they can pray, they are they will perform Hajj and Umrah, and they will benefit from that process. No doubts about that. But as a community, and as the larger philosophical purpose of Hajj, I think it's half the role that we are fulfilling. So if it's not complete fard, it's half the fard that we're performing today. Why? Because the Hajj, the larger philosophy behind the Hajj is to bring different communities together so that they can interact with each other. They travel, they bring their goods along. It's like, Expo 2024. They're bringing their crafts, they're bringing their trade, they're making relationships with other people. And so sometimes I feel, why did God made it mandatory for every Muslim who could bear the expenses to perform Hajj at least once? I think there are layers upon layers upon layers of meaning in that. It is to say, if I am, you know, in a little town outside Oxford, if I'm living somewhere, or if I'm living in the far corners of Africa, if I'm living in the far corners of a desert, I go out, I connect with my community, I travel, I make relationships, I sell goods, I learn new crafts, I trade with those people as well. And through that, I create a solidarity which is completely different from anything that you see today. I mean, have you ever seen a more powerful image than the Hajj, than people moving around the Kaaba? You know, with so many different color and dispensations and regions, and rich and poor people, it's immensely powerful. So, to me, as a social scientist, I'm increasingly feeling that yes, if God allows me the opportunity, inshallah, one day I want to do Hajj, and it might be, I might be fulfilling my obligation because that's all I can do. But that's not the obligation that God asked us for. God created that larger space for something bigger. It's not just a space where you go and you just interact with other people from UK, perform your Hajj, have your buffet, make your prayers, come back. No, no, no. That's just the start of it. That's just the start of it. And so this is what I want to just leave before you. Some of these thoughts. Some of them would be naive for more esteemed scholars like yourself, Osama. But I'm just placing some of these thoughts before all of you, and look forward to having more discussion. And I'm very happy to talk more about contemporary dynamics as well, because I realize uh, I've focused more on the historical part so far. I'll stop there.
Jazakumullah khair, and thank you so much, Adil, for really a sort of kaleidoscopic trip through history down to the present, looking at the way in which economics is, in some respects, a central aspect of early Islamic history that is often ignored. So you teased out very important dynamics at play within Meccan society and the context in which the Prophet ﷺ receives revelation, and the reason for it to find a receptive audience in that context, because it addresses very real concerns that arise from a particular economic context and reinforces them and speaks about them in very explicit terms. You mentioned the concept of ilaf, and this brings us to the Surah Quraysh, where this is explicitly highlighted as one of the blessings that God has placed upon the Meccans. Um, so there are various dimensions, and to what you said, very rich series of reflections, and of course you brought it to the present day, and you know, in a sense, closed it with some of these reflections on the challenges of integration within this context. But in a sense, you got the ball rolling in us thinking about the next stage of the current discussion. And I want to remind audience members that you're welcome to type in questions for Dr. Adil. In the course of this discussion, we'll try and address as many of them as possible. You're also welcome to share comments, because some have already started doing that. I just want to highlight a comment from my colleague at Cardiff University, Maulana and Dr. Harun Sidat, who was referencing your earlier comment, Adil, about the fact that you're not necessarily someone who's trained as an alim, but you want to share some reflections in these areas. And someone like myself, I'm not really trained as an economist, and I really think that these are so important for me to understand, to be able to engage theologically and as an alim in a more productive fashion. So this sort of interdisciplinary conversation, and in a sense intercivilizational, because the social sciences, as Dipesh Chakrabarti has pointed out, is a product of the European Enlightenment in various ways, and it needs to be brought into a more universal discourse. And the ulum sharia are very much a product of Islamic civilization historically, and our historical forms of knowledge need to be rethought and reintegrated into contemporary discourse to be productive in that way. So my good friend Harun Sidat points out that the integration of the ulum, and that is religion and social science, is one of the urgent needs of our time. So he was kind of reflecting on your initial comment. And so please do keep the questions coming. I will sort of direct them to Dr. Adil. But if it's okay, I'm going to use my chair's privilege to sort of reflect on some of the points that you've said and ask you some follow-up questions. As I say, a very rich conversation, but in some respects, sort of a lot more than we can sort of encapsulate in the course of our discussion here. I wanted to ask specifically about capitalism as an economic order within which we currently live. It's also something that's gone through stages, and some would argue that we are now in the neoliberal stage of capitalist engagement. And I wonder if it's meaningful for us to think about what some of the early sort of pioneering thinkers argued for, a kind of Islamic economic system. And in that context, I just want to highlight, I'm sure you're familiar with our colleague from Leeds, Salman Sayed's work, and he reflects on the idea of developing a Muslim economic bloc in the way that we have economic blocs around the world. And that's, in some respects, what you're talking about, as being quite a challenging but important and necessary question for us to explore. Um, is it meaningful for us to think in terms of um, ideology before creating the economy? Or is it more meaningful for us to think in the way that Europe, in a sense, has done, develop certain types of economic practices and then sort of reflect on what they actually mean in practice, uh, transfer from the practice to the theory? So I would suggest maybe mercantilism and then, capitalism and various forms of economic practice are reflections of current practice within European societies at certain points in history. Um, what would it take for Muslims to develop an Islamic economic ideological framework, for want of a better expression?
Thank you. This is firstly Harun's emphasis on the integration between different type of looms is absolutely spot on, and whatever I described to you today is a product of that. And it was kind of interesting that I was able to discover or at least recover some new elements or some different elements, in part because I was reading my own history as a social scientist. And so, ultimately, we are talking about universal wisdom, right? We are talking about um, some of these frameworks that ultimately came for human benefit. And so many other people have thought about those questions. How do we really conceptualize those questions? You require the integration of different sciences. And there's obviously in economics, there's a positive economics, there's a normative economics. A lot of the questions in economics are normative questions. You know, what should be the level of taxation, how much inequality, right? A lot of that comes down to question of normative assumptions. Now, your question about these, ideology versus practice. Um, I must start by saying I don't have a good answer for that because I'm myself still confused about that particular question. But let me offer you my sense, where I'm getting at. I think I am, as an economist, I am a bit uncomfortable thinking about isms, capitalism, socialism, right? These many different. I find it more interesting to think about who has power. I like to ask those questions that revolve around power, because you could have a capitalist system where a few actors end up having a lot of power and help to dictate whatever the market is doing, and you have lots of contemporary and historical examples around that. Or you could have socialism where just the state or a few actors in the state are deciding, right? So ultimately, in every system, the question really becomes whatever system you have, you're really looking at the balance between the market and the state and the community, right? What sort of balance you need that. Um, so I think that is a more important question than just going through isms. And I'm also personally uncomfortable, slightly uncomfortable, at least now, maybe not in the future, but at least at the moment, I'm a little uncomfortable about creating a very different dogmatic approach within economics. So that's why I've been slightly critical of Islamic economics. So, you know, I like what um, Tariq Ramadan used to say, rather than Islamic economics, we need to think about Islamic ethics in economics or Islamic ethics in finance. Um, and I think because once you create that larger ideological frame, it becomes fixed. It becomes more and more difficult to change it. So I would come to that question really from the perspective of, um, you know, justice, power, who has power, maslaha, maqasid, right? Those sorts of questions about what is the idea of public good, what type of an economic framework can ensure public good, right? And you read and come across so many different discourses within Islam, in fiqh, in other books as well, about when are certain transactions taking place, what is the role of, are they just, um, are they fair to the future generations, what is, I mean, just a very question about ownership of an asset, right? So whether you own something is itself philosophically a question that you cannot just address through capitalism, socialism, and Islam. I mean, Islam is a very beautiful, nuanced approach to what an asset is, right? You know, I'm speaking through my mind as a scholar.
Right.
I believe I own the skills and the scholarship, right? I own my intellectual property, but actually not.
Right.
It's not unconditional ownership.
Right.
It's in that path of surrender to God. It's a, I am the portal through which the divine can express. I am the portal through which good things need to come out for other people, right? And yes, I'm appropriating my knowledge and I'm learning, but I'm constantly surrendering myself to God to make sure that what I own is of use for the community. And that is the reason why, you know, there were so many departures from prophetic practice, whereby, uh, uh, Caliph Umar was taking away sometimes land from people, and lands that were given by the Prophet himself to some of those people. And they would protest and say, look, how can you take away the land that? And they said, well, the Prophet didn't give you the land to keep it, uncultivated. It had to be cultivated in order for it to benefit everyone.
Right.
So, as a social scientist, when I look at some of these debates, I realize that the the ultimate purpose is justice and and public good and protection of humanity, protection of honor. There are a lot of these principles that are undergirding these debates, and we have to constantly understand whether or not any system at any point in time is delivering that. So for me, this emphasis on different isms is a kind of distraction from the core question of who has power, who's creating value, who's extracting value, what is the impact of any economic arrangement on social justice.
Right.
Those are the questions that inspire me a lot more.
So perhaps just as a clarification, I would say that I'm thinking of the term ideology in the spirit of Michael Frieden's work, and so he's kind of revived ideology as a sort of subset within political theory. I think he's probably retired now, but he used to be at Mansfield College, and I think in his sort of sense of ideology, it's basically a framework for thinking about political questions which is accessible at multiple levels of complexity, meaning it's also available at a mass level. And one of the challenges we perhaps have on the ideological question is at the level of mass discourse, there are ways in which we can meaningfully talk about and have references to more sophisticated discourses when it comes to various economic ideologies or political ideologies. And in the Islamic tradition, as you kind of alluded to, when it comes to the more substantive discourse around questions of justice, around questions of power, right now we haven't, I think, systematically formulated a more high-level discourse, and our discourse at a popular level isn't necessarily pointing at something which is more nuanced or more sophisticated at the levels of at higher levels of discourse. Is something which one of our founding sort of institutional members, who Professor Raymond Anjum, has written about, that in a sort of article he wrote about a decade ago called "Do Islamists Have an Intellectual Deficit?" And I think in that spirit, there needs to be, as you suggest, like a greater inquiry into these philosophical concepts like justice. Um,
I
and
think this is a great point. This is a fabulous point because I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, more than these isms, these larger moral questions and questions of ideology and how people understand religion.
right,
You see, it's one thing to talk about moral economy in a very intellectual way, and
right,
it's another to actually think about what is moral economy in the eyes of the people. And unfortunately, a lot of the discussion that we have, public discussion, it's all about usury, it's about what financial transaction is halal or haram, right? But we haven't really created a larger public discourse that concerns these bread and butter issues, right? So, for example, I'll give you a couple of examples. Um, when there is a monopolist who's hoarding goods or is a monopolist who's distorting the market, it's not often seen as a major moral sort of departure, right? In the public eye, sometimes. Similarly, there are lots of other economic arrangements that are hugely unjust. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised to read in um, Ibn Khaldun's work when he thinks about justice. He's talking about another element of justice where he says there are a lot of these merchants who are allied to the palace and they get all the best deals. The juiciest deals go to them, and there are many other merchants who don't have the same access, and therefore they are disincentivized. So that again is a very live, very direct interpretation of justice, and I think it's also not without a reason that many of the ulama have been kept away from these larger questions of economic justice because that would be problematic for the
right,
powers that be.
right,
You
right,
know, if you were to decide what, you know, a state owns land or a state owns oil or a state owns potassium or any other natural resource, who owns that resource?
mm,
Do people own that resource? Is it the state? Some people in the state, right? Those questions are so critical. And ultimately, a lot of the conflict that we see, both political conflict and other kind of civil conflict, is over conflict over the distribution of resources.
right,
And of all the religions, Islam is one of the most active commentator on
right,
those questions.
right,
Yet in the present day, a lot of the public moral discussion about Islam is about everything except for many of those crucial questions of
right.
distribution.
Right, right. In some respects, I've sort of argued, not in writing yet, but that this is a kind of secularization of Islam, because the things that really matter in the public sphere, in a sense, have been marginalized in our discourses. And people can talk about personal, private piety, and that's fine. And the scholars can talk about this, but they can't talk about you know, can the ruler of a Gulf monarchy treat the oil wealth as a personal fief, so to speak, as they actually do in practice? And those are really, those have massive social and political implications. But for that reason, I don't think it's necessarily sort of scholars are not allowed to talk about it, but there's, in the interest of self-preservation, you will stay
Yes.
silent about these sorts of things, unfortunately. And perhaps that places a greater burden on those of us who don't live in those sorts of contexts to actually think very clear-sightedly and openly about these questions. Um, I wanted to bring in a question from an audience member, which is framed in very simple terms, and I may elaborate it a little. But you've actually addressed a lot of these questions already. And it's someone called A. Ibrahim is saying, with all the challenges found or taken into consideration, how can Muslims start today with economic integration in practical terms? And you outlined several challenges that included the fact that within Muslim societies today, politics is a major question. These aren't very often representative countries, and so if we start engaging in this sort of integration, it does cede certain amounts of sovereignty, particularly in the economic sphere, that political rulers are unwilling to do. There is mutual mistrust very often. There is, I think, we saw the Gulf crisis of 2017 to 2020, I think, and that is an illustration of the sorts of challenges that these sorts of countries have. And I wonder, you mentioned zero sum competition or the perception of that, xenophobic nationalism, egregious inequalities. And I wonder if you have any reflections on what would it actually take. I understand you're not necessarily a normative economist here, but perhaps you can step into that role for the purpose of this question and reflect on what would it actually take for Muslims to bring about that sort of reintegration. And you basically talk about early Islamic economic order being grounded in a specific vision. Is this ultimately about reshaping the vision that we have for society, and at what levels of society does that kind of reimagining of the social imaginary need to take place?
Um, at many levels, you need to have that discussion. Um, I think in general, you would have seen that in the wake of the Arab uprisings, you had some opportunity in Tunisia and Egypt and other places, right, where more religious-minded parties came to power. But I found that their economic discourse was very vacuous as well. They didn't have a very clear sense of what they want in
Mm,
terms of economy.
mm,
In the Arab world, there's always been discussion about Arab regional integration.
mm.
People had already always wanted to have that kind of trade.
Right,
Um, but you know, the discourse never really took off, right? And today there is hardly any discourse on that front.
mm,
But you do know where it has taken place. So if you think about Turkey, although it disbanded its own zero problems policy with the neighbors, but you could see for a very short period of time when they did pursue that, there were clear economic dividends of
mm,
that policy because you can then integrate domestically using the
mm,
various cultural linkages. Now, at the level of the state, I'm afraid states only go for integration when it's in their political interests.
yeah,
Morocco is doing it now in West Africa. Some of the GCC states are doing it amongst themselves. Um, it's ultimately when those who are in power consider integration to be one of their key objectives when they have. Unfortunately, in large parts of the Muslim world, you have rentier structures where you have either a lot of oil being available, oil rents being available, or aid and remittances. So that gives you certain kinds of autonomy from integration. Right? But there is another form of integration that is already there. So if you go across the world, particularly in states that are very closed, um, there is already smuggling taking place. Smuggling is an alternative form of integration. It's like border communities saying, "Look, we don't follow the state
right,
sanctioned tariffs, right? And we will trade despite the state not letting us trade." So all across the Arab world, you find border spaces being hugely contested spaces, uh, contested as in the state's mainstream economic policy is being contested.
right,
Um, so I think ultimately it requires a new intellectual awakening on what it means to have economic commons and how central are economic commons to thinking about Ummah, uh, and then translating it into action. This is a very difficult prospect, obviously,
right,
because the way the borders are defined, the way the international structure is designed, it's very hard. People for people to recognize that these links existed way back in time. I mean, if you read um, an article on, let's say, Baghdad in a particular period, or you read about um, Damascus even in 1800s or 1700s, you find those cities as important zones of exchanges where trade is coming from all different parts of the world and it's coming in. Um, and that's strengthening communities, creating new types of linkages. In a way, we do have new visions of integration being created internationally. China has Belt and Road. There are other types of new infrastructure connectivity projects coming on board, but we don't have similar intellectual imagination even when it comes to Muslim societies. We don't have a lot of scholars who are saying, look, we need this new economic infrastructure
Right.
that could bring communities together and let people benefit from each other.
Right.
Um, in fact, sometimes I'm surprised that we have lots of these programs like Fulbright scholarship programs. You have,
Right.
um, the Chevening scholarships for developing countries that Britain gives out. And it's a great opportunity for many of these scholars to come to Britain or to come to the US. But I don't see many programs where people can travel
Hmm.
amongst Muslim societies, right? So
Right.
I was very fortunate because I was based at Oxford. So I could go to Algiers, I could go to Morocco, to Tunisia, other places, and witnessed as a South Asian, you know, the similarities and differences in these. And that makes me
Hmm.
what I am today. It's almost like saying, um, Mir Sayyid Ali Hamdani went to Hijaz, he went to Damascus, he learned about Ibn Arabi, he came back, he traveled again to Central Asia, to Iran. You look at Ibn al-Arabi, like he was traveling around, from
Right.
Al-Andalus to all the way to Morocco, to Hijaz, to Damascus. And imagine these scholars, their worldview being shaped by traveling and staying and interacting with so many different communities. That's
Right.
what made them.
Yeah.
How can you imagine that you could have an Islamic Renaissance today without those sorts of rich exchanges? And so that is what we need today is to
Hmm.
is to have greater and perhaps in a way, these web exchanges
Yeah.
are an imperfect substitute, but they're happening where some of those exchanges can take place. Um, but travel and trade are both key parts of it. Now, the fact that we live in modern nation states and it's difficult to create it, fine, but you could create sub economies within states, right? In the sense that you have, you know, small regions that are unintegrated, uh, border to border exchanges. But again, it's where individuals have very little agency. It's where the states need to do it. But rather than waiting for the states to do it, we need new intellectuals who make that argument in a powerful way and create the pressure points for change at the level of the community.
I think that's really a fascinating sort of way of thinking about this because, in a sense, you're placing the onus on intellectuals, right? You're saying that because earlier I framed the question of thinking about the way in which an economic model kind of comes into formation and then intellectuals reflect on it. To a certain extent, as you mentioned after the Arab Spring, and we all witnessed this, some people explicitly commented that, all of these folks, so-called Islamist parties coming into power. I know that some scholars have a problem with the term Islamist. Um, they, in many respects, kind of reproduced the problems of the current economic system in their own societies because economic models are uh, sort of, to a certain extent, quite difficult to viably propose without having the levers of economic power in one's hands. Um, so, I mean, I think the argument that you're making about having an intellectual awakening, as you put it, I think that's a very sort of interesting and important um, uh, way of approaching this question. And I hope that the Ummatics Institute can actually be, and people like ourselves, in a small way, can contribute to that intellectual awakening. But this hopefully means that we're going to have more and more conversations on these themes and topics as we go
Could I,
forward.
yeah, could I come in very quickly
Please,
in
absolutely.
terms of, what you want is a regionally integrated merchant class, because once merchants benefit from that situation, they are in the driving seat, right? So that's happening in Morocco, for example. A lot of West Africa is opening up to Morocco. Moroccan banks are going to West Africa. There's a lot more trade and cooperation. Turkey implemented that model too. So there was the beginnings, at least through the Turkish model, there was the beginnings of a model where countries were using their cultural capital
Right,
to foster economic linkages, which then brought benefits for their business communities,
right.
who were in turn powerful for their political classes. So a lot of this really requires these creation of new networks, because
Mm,
this is the world of networks, and we
right,
know those who control power control the networks. And so, how could you create new um, sort of networks, material networks, intellectual networks that help to create this? And the reason I emphasize the scholarly input is that I believe that the Muslim scholar today is more timid, is not bold enough. And I'm saying Muslim scholar as in economist scholars. So I'm talking about the economists per se.
right.
They are not bold enough in creating a new vision.
Mm,
It's all based on whatever we know through received wisdom in economics, or what the IMF says, or others, right? You need a new economic vision that is more culturally sensitive, and that is able to make the point that, look, you need to think beyond the border.
right,
Unless you think beyond the border,
right.
you are unable to solve some of the most contemporary challenges. I mean, it's clear to me, as someone who studies the Arab world.
Yeah,
Think about Jordan. Any issue in Jordan, whether it's water, whether it's energy, whether it's any issue that you can think about,
mm,
requires you to actually solve that problem, not just within Jordan, but
right.
through cooperation with many of the other neighboring states.
Right, right. And also thinking, as you pointed out, about geopolitics and the
Yes.
interests that superpowers have in maintaining the status quo. I mean, it reminded me very much of, the classic colonial mechanism of divide and conquer or divide and rule. And so much of the sort of Muslim world is in that condition. And in some respects, I think it's the efforts of Ummatics is to discursively intervene in that space, and inshallah, that's the least we can do at this stage. There are a lot of questions that are sort of connected to that question of integration, but I wanted to just sort of connect back to the social science versus traditional ulama dimension briefly with Harun Sidat added a comment saying any ritual in Islam is inextricably interwoven with the horizontal social, that is sociality and economics. The challenge among many is epistemological, where the sciences are bracketed off from each other, and I think he's talking about the Islamic sciences. And I hope that it is, well, the Islamic sciences and the social sciences. And he says, my hope is that those trained in Islamic sciences are just as well versed in the social sciences. So this kind of goes back to an earlier comment that we were talking about. Um, there are sort of a number of questions which are connected to integration. I wanted to, um, ask a question that connected to the Hajj because you made a point about this, and Abdullah asks, how could the Hajj sort of be a source of economic integration, as it were? Do you have a particular reflection on that?
Yes. So the Hajj, obviously, I'm not saying that we go back to the old times where people are bringing goods on camels,
Oh,
and then they're selling them there. But it's clear that the Hajj provided an opportunity for the community to integrate with each other.
Right.
And one form of integration was to be able to meet each other and to be able to share ideas, and to actually exchange goods,
Right.
right? It's a powerful sort of opportunity every year when millions of Muslims descend in this important town. They have an amazing opportunity to interact, to create, more like an Expo 2024, right? There's, if you could really use that opportunity to create those linkages in much the same way as any major tourist attraction today creates linkages with investment, linkages and other things. I mean, um, it's a ready-made forum for that. But in
Right.
a sense,
Right.
we have created that uh, sort of division between what is religious. You just
Yes.
come in, you stay in your own national little sort of section, and you perform all the necessary tick boxes, and then you go back. That to
Right.
me is a very, very partial, very um, incomplete view of the Hajj. Whereas to me, as a social scientist, the Hajj is a powerful means of integration for the community. I'll give you one example. I went to Marrakesh once and went to a carpet weaver's shop, and there was one very interesting design that was more like South Asian. These are Central Asian, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, that kind of carpet design. And
Right.
so I asked him whether it was woven
Mm.
in Morocco, and he said, "Well, yes, it was." And I was surprised. It was the only piece.
Mm.
Uh, and those who've seen Moroccan carpets, they're very different uh,
Mm.
in their texture and design. So he said it's a long story, but basically, our family's been in this business for over a century, and we used to take our goods to the Hajj,
Mm.
and there we will meet different types of merchants, craft sellers, and we will exchange notes of the type of fabric they use, the type of techniques they use to weave these carpets, and they
Mm.
used to learn from us, and we will learn from them, and so this skill has passed on. Here you have a very beautiful example
Right.
of the way in which that one interaction way back in time of carpet sellers is had long duration impact.
Right.
So there is a we are not saying that this is something um, that cannot be done. It was done long way back, right? So the Hajj has, if you travel through Africa, for example, or if you travel through the Middle East, you can tell which were the Hajj routes.
Right.
You
Right.
can tell those towns are different. Those towns have very different flavor.
Mm.
You can tell which communities are being affected through that, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so, eh, the idea that you cannot create a new community through those exchanges and create greater economic opportunities, economic collaboration, it seems to me that this, if we were to rethink about Hajj in those terms, then they create an entirely different vision of the world. But unfortunately, that vision of the world could have political and geopolitical consequences. But at least in the context of a scholar or in the context of a
Yeah.
believer, it's important to aspire for those things.
So, I mean, shifting briefly to geopolitics, perhaps, and I think once again we're very privileged in Europe, in some respects, that we don't have the kinds of political pressures that scholars in the Middle East might have when they're commenting on these sorts of contexts. We may have other political pressures that we need to deal with, but not ones that limit our comments on questions of economic integration in the Middle East and the political implications of that, because that means the relinquishing of certain privileges on the part of the political class in these societies. And I guess my question would be, someone, Mustafa is asking, there's no doubt that there are, Ummatic sentiment is to be found throughout the Ummah. and the notion of greater integration is quite a powerful idea. Muslims feel a strong connection with other Muslims in other parts of the world. And this is something that we see reflected in the Hajj when people visit from the ends of the earth and they meet each other and they actually sort of can find that point of connection. Yet, this requires political will. And how do I guess the political will dimension is not being asked very explicitly here. Rather, the question is when you have two separate economic structures that have been created in practice, how do two economic, you know, structures with different histories, with different trajectories, if they wanted to integrate, what does that look like in practice? Um, if you have any thoughts on this, inshallah.
So, can you repeat a little bit? So, in terms of different structures, what do you mean by different structures? Like people coming from different economic structures?
So, in the sense that you have two different polities, the question actually is framed as how would two separate economies institutionally unify? So, when you have different economies in the Muslim world that want to create that integration, the greater integration, what does that look like in practice? And this is basically drawing probably on sort of Arab regional integration discourse to a certain extent. But if we were to think that of that across the Ummah, um, is there a blueprint that is plausible that has been proposed by anyone at this point in time?
So obviously, it would be relevant to think about industries, about clusters. It has to be, one of the problems with these grand approaches is
Yeah,
that they typically then fall flat because they're not carefully worked through. So
yeah,
you need political support from the top, but at the same time,
right,
you need to be able to build, you know, from the bottoms up. In a sense, you could see in Dubai you had that freedom for different communities to come, interact, create value, and
right,
that basic level of freedom is required to create those linkages. And
right,
there it has worked in many, many interesting ways, in the
right,
financial sector at least, in the real estate sector, some of the other new entrepreneurial areas, law
right,
as well. Um, so ultimately, you need to think about bottoms up process where
mm,
there are always opportunities. When we
mm,
think about people, they're always um, thinking about opportunities that are complementary, that create complementarities.
right,
Um, Businessmen who are, but a lot of this problem is the problem of information.
mm,
Unless you allow it, make it easier for people to travel and to create institutional linkages, right?
right,
And so I would start with, linkages between different chambers of commerce and industry, because
right,
that's where, one of the reasons why Turkey has had success in this. Wherever Erdogan will travel, he will take 200 businessmen along, or their different industry associations along.
right, right,
So the more, because traders have their own language, businessmen have their own
right,
language, and the
right,
more they're able to interact across these different communities.
right,
And if you were to reduce the barriers to travel, that is half the job.
right,
Because when people travel across to different places, they know what is in demand,
mm,
what type
mm,
of new relationships they can form,
right,
uh, and so that helps them. I mean, in a very simple context, for example, the Tablighi Jamaat in South Asia, you could
right,
see when people interact a lot more, there are lots of new business ideas as well. And I've seen
mm,
through my first-hand knowledge how different people have actually started new businesses through those interactions as well.
that's amazing.
Um,
If I
so I
could
think it
add,
has to be micro level from the grounds up.
if I could just add, I mean, Mustafa also added while you were talking that, for example, East and West Germany, North and South Yemen, um, that sort of integration to be successful, like, I don't know if either of these contexts you'll be familiar with, but can that be used as a model on a micro scale, and then that sort of like is brought, as you say, these grand sort of like ideas, the devil is always in the detail to sort of use perhaps a,
Yes, so I mean, I would say that's more like de jure integration. Like
hmm,
East and West Germany became one, North and South Yemen became one.
yeah, yeah,
I don't think that's very practical these
mm,
days.
Mm.
It, what is more practical is to make it a coherent trading zone. So I'm not saying Jordan should not be Jordan, or Syria should not be Syria,
Right.
right?
Right.
Or Lebanon should surrender its own sovereignty.
Right.
But it's more about creating less thick economic borders and allowing them to act as a coherent trading zone.
Right.
So the situation that you have at the moment is as follows. If you have to export stuff to Turkey, right, from Jordan, the Jordanian trucks will leave Jordan, and on the border on Iraq, they will have to change the goods because of some silly regulations. You have to change the goods,
Mm.
offload your stuff,
Yeah.
and then put them into new trucks
Right.
and pay a number of people on the border.
Right.
Then the trucks ply on the Iraqi roads.
Mm.
But within Iraq, they have to pay lots of different toll taxes. And
Right.
again, there are different groups who are controlling those revenue streams,
Right.
right? Adding
Right.
on the cost of trading. And then you get you reach Turkey,
Mm.
and on the Turkish border, you again have to offload
Right. Right.
your stuff and then get into the new trucks. Now, regional trade is a trade which, without restrictions, would grow like gravity, right? It's just very simple. It makes sense
Right.
for people in Saudi to buy Syrian, vegetables and fruits because that's the closest place. That's where
Mm.
historically fruit has always been coming through,
Mm.
right? Um, but unfortunately, the whole question about regional trade is interwoven with the question about borders, who control borders.
Right.
Unfortunately, um, a lot of these situations exist in what we describe in economics as equilibria, stable equilibria, because there
Right.
are enough number of actors who are benefiting from a status quo.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for us to shift from that protectionist status
Yeah.
quo to a
Yeah.
more integrated order,
Mm.
it requires a shock to completely close that and create new order.
Right.
That's why a lot of the efforts at integration, whether in East Asia or whether Belt and Road or other types of initiatives, require higher order action. They require a big push. They
Yeah.
require a big push to
Right.
move in that direction. Which for individuals is difficult, but they require a national vision
Yeah.
to think about.
I mean,
And
it,
obviously, when we think about, sorry for interruption, but when we think about integrating the whole Muslim world,
yeah.
that is a very difficult prospect. And what you want is more organic spaces wherever they exist,
Right.
right? And
Right.
so small sub-economies or sub-regional
Mm.
economies. I mean,
Mm.
if you've seen in Morocco's case, they've said, okay, we cannot trade with the Arab world. There are lots of problems there at the moment, but let's use our spiritual connections with West Africa, especially the Sufi orders in West Africa,
Mm. Mm.
and let's deploy that cultural capital and
Right.
create a corridor of integration in West Africa.
Right.
So they're actually becoming more successful. So ultimately, you have to make regional integration compatible with the incentives of the ruling elites. The ruling elites must see their benefit.
Right.
The more they will benefit from that sort of close interaction, the easier it will become. But it's very clear to me as a social scientist
Right.
that the problem of diversification in the Arab world. Every government talks about economic diversification, moving away from oil.
Right.
Every government talks about youth unemployment.
Right.
Every government talks about private sector development. In some of my work, I've highlighted that
Yeah.
none of these three challenges can be addressed without thinking about the regional question, about creating a regional market.
Fascinating. I mean, I think the point that you made just before this final point is quite key, which is you need the political elites to be on board. I mean, the disruption model that we saw, in a sense, in the Arab Spring, had it been successful, who knows, maybe that would have been a model that could be replicated going into a democratic transition. But until then, in a sense, what you're suggesting is you want to have as little disruption to the political status quo as possible, while still, gradually bringing people to see the benefits of including the political elites in particular, the benefits of economic integration, that may actually be a sort of more, uh, I mean, actually a more practical step towards realizing that sort of integration, rather than trying to rage against the system, or rail against the current status quo, and say that it needs a root and branch restructuring. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. The sort of the root and branch option is very unpredictable and cannot really be socially engineered, whereas the gradualist approach maybe can be encouraged and will receive less political pushback.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm not very knowledgeable about how that transition would come about, but
Right.
certainly we need a gradual, incremental approach.
Mm,
Um, and I think there's a lot to learn from the Western experience. Right?
mm,
So after the French Revolution, it's only when the guilds were abolished that the more city
mm,
to city integration came about. And
okay.
even today, I mean, was recently delivering a talk at Sciences Po in Lille, and I was going around the city in France. That French city is a Flemish city, and you realize the guide was telling me about the different hotels and restaurants and shops, and I was asking who comes here, who buys goods, and it was very clear in the
Mm,
first 5 minutes that it's not just people of Lille, it's
right.
people in Belgium,
Right.
people in Netherlands, people up there north of France and Germany,
Right.
who are coming to the city, who are buying stuff, who are setting up shops. And so it has become the center for a lot of regional investments.
Right.
It is in their interest that this peaceful order remains, and that
Right.
this particular town remains open for business.
Right.
Um, and unfortunately, as social scientists, we know very little about how societies move between
Mm,
this equilibrium, because there was a history of these Flemish towns where there was constant fighting and
right.
fighting over small rent streams. These places were more like fiefdoms for particular royal families or particular
Right.
merchant groups.
Right.
There's an entire history of the market of Flanders, right, and how that market operated, and who was rich, who had power, who would control, who can connect with whom. I mean,
Mm,
these are questions that have um, bedeviled so many different communities way back in time. They're not just questions that that affect us, but it's certainly true that we are at the moment stuck in an equilibrium which is a more protectionist equilibrium,
mm,
where influential actors control the markets,
right.
and that that control is crucial for their political control. So they're not going to loosen that control
Right.
very easily. But there are states like Malaysia, Indonesia,
Right.
even Bangladesh now with its very vibrant, textile manufacturing,
Mm,
where you see the emergence of new communities who are finding prosperity through integration with the rest
right.
of the world, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, but more
Mm,
integration with the rest of the world. And it's allowing them to travel more, to create more networks. I think in all of this, the crucial thing is greater travel, greater exchange of ideas mm, between different Muslim communities, because that's the very stepping stone for economic exchanges.
so perhaps I can sort of ask somewhat relatedly, but somewhat um, perhaps at odds as well with what you've just suggested, which is the the question of economic inequality. You actually said in the course of your discussion that actually that's a dimension of this which needs reflection, because usually opening these sorts of opening up the commons, and creating sort of free trade um, environments can also enrich the few at the not necessarily at the expense of the many, but relative to the many. And I think economic inequality is one of these areas which is not particularly well studied by Islamic thinkers that I've seen, but it's one of the big questions of early 21st century capitalism. And one thinks of Thomas Piketty's book in particular. And I wanted to ask, is there, do you have any reflections in particular with respect to the question of economic integration or ummatic solidarity that pertain to the question of economic inequality? You just mentioned Bangladesh as having a very vibrant textile sort of industry, and it has actually, uh, as you are well aware, sort of per capita economic growth has surpassed India and Pakistan at this point. And yet, it is a highly unequal society. It's politically speaking a basket case. Perhaps not as bad as Pakistan, but it's been a one-party state for a long time now, and so one wonders like how economic inequality is to be dealt with within the question of solidarity building, within the question of creating greater economic integration that will undoubtedly enrich certain groups of people, but is definitely necessary as a stepping stone to thinking about regional integration, leading to potentially something we can aspire to through an intellectual vision, ummatic integration of some kind.
Yes, so I think inequality is something that um, is an is a necessary byproduct in a market. When some actors become more powerful, they grow, and then they have more political influence.
Right.
Um, that's why people who have worked on these subjects, people like Luigi Zingales, for example, talks about the Goldilocks equilibrium, the
Mm.
balance between the economic and political power, and
Right.
that balance goes off in many cases. In some cases, economic power begins to dictate political power. In other cases, this political power begins to dictate economic power. So
Mm.
you always need, it's a continuous struggle within society.
Mm.
And that's where the view of the world is extremely important, because I think um, as Muslims, the way we are taught about how lives are finite, how important is charity, how important is to give away. I mean, this is where, I cannot find so many other religious traditions where the emphasis on giving away, on
Mm.
giving away, is so crucial. And so you then build up those ideas. That's where your ideology comes to power.
Mm.
That's where your cognitive models come to power,
Right. Right.
where people are willing to sacrifice and give away for the
Right.
benefit of the community. So I think that idea is so powerful, is so well ingrained in the Muslim communities that most of the contemporary discussions about inequality will find the most obvious home in Muslim societies.
Fascinating.
It's a very interesting point that whenever I read about discussions of inequality in the West, it's almost like you want to create, bring back the idea of how important it is to have that equality.
Mm.
You know, um, in many of the Muslim communities, there already is such deep sensitization for
Mm.
those questions. There's a long history
Fascinating.
um, in theology and in
Right.
practice about those questions, that there's a ready-made constituency
Right.
where that sensitization can take place and could be institutionally translated. Lots of Muslim societies where variety of charitable initiatives have institutionalized that thinking for the state. So I think that's one element I will highlight. The other is to really highlight autonomy and participation. That market requires continuous check. Whenever you have um, an economy growing, you need to make sure that it always remains open
Right.
to new actors who
Right.
can challenge the old ones. It's all about contestation of power,
Mm.
and that happens when you have more opportunities. Um, in the early Meccan experience, the ability of the smaller merchants to pool their pool their money in order to participate in trade is obviously a key part of that process. But it's something that we have to continuously work at.
Right.
You know, you can never really think about an economic system where you have solved the problem of economy and you have solved the problem of inequality and you go home and sleep. No,
Right.
it's always that
Dynamic.
that dynamic where the balance between economic and political power, between prosperity and inequality, has to be kept at bay. It's
So, I
almost
mean,
like our iman, right? Where we have to. fight.
Right. Iman sort of going up and down. And may Allah increase us, inshallah. I mean, in that connection with inequality, one also, what comes to mind is the context of global kind of economic structures over the last few centuries. And Jason Hickel has argued in his book on sort of the global south versus the global north, the divide, that actually global economic structures for the last century or so have structurally and systematically siphoned off vast amounts of wealth from the south to the north. And I wonder, I mean, this I'm not an expert in this area, much more your terrain, but is this the sort of thing that um, Islamic economic integration can work against, and could this be used as an incentive for making people think about or political elites think about how they may themselves benefit from economic integration? Of course, political elites are the ones who are kind of structurally bought off by these sorts of incentive structures that siphon off vast amounts of wealth, or at least that's what I suspect would happen. I wonder if you have any reflections on that.
Yes, I mean, in a way, you have a system of extraction in place, and there are so many different manifestations of it. I mentioned myself that many countries today are not at freedom to decide who to trade with, who to connect their infrastructure with. There are real questions of sovereignty. The idea that there is free trade and anybody can do anything, not really. International finance is a key constraint. Some of these structures, if you're thinking about Pakistan and Egypt, they survive because of the availability of international finance. Otherwise, those authoritarian orders will crumble on their own.
Right,
So they're propped up because of this.
right.
Um, and there is, of course, different types of extractive linkages. Um, Now, how do you create a new environment? How do you move out of that? Is first thing is consciousness. You need
Right.
to have that consciousness about who has economic power, how we are exploited, how can we create new forms of solidarity. And that's where economic solidarity between communities has historically been one of the best ways in which you fight that exploitation, is to create those new. And the best way to do that is to create linkages with communities around yourself. So if the countries that are close enough, that are next door neighbors, that's where you begin to create, greater linkages. But it's a very difficult question because, um, any exploitative economic structure that is exploitative, that is extractive, creates local allies. There are powerful local allies. Often these allies are members of the military, members of the key intellectual classes, political incumbents who are beneficiaries of that exploitative structure. So it's not just a case. That's why scholars have often talked about the idea of extraversion. Um, and so
Extroversion.
extraversion, which is more like uh, linkages between local elites and international structures.
Right. I mean, I think Pakistan and Egypt are two instances where the sort of military elites, in particular, having that sort of control has been a struggle. But I also, I want to underline for everyone listening that these are going to be long-term. They have to be long-term sustained efforts at rethinking. They're not going to be sort of a cookie cutter sort of a proposal that is then applied, and within a short period of time that sort of transformation takes place. And I think all of your questions underline that, all of your responses underline that in a very helpful way. I wanted to highlight a question that's just come in, and we have not very much time left, unfortunately, but really have been thoroughly enjoying this discussion, and this may actually be our last question for the evening, but it's a short one from Jukaku Tayyib, who asks, it's in relation to a comment you made about monopolies earlier. Should Muslim societies prevent monopolies to maintain a power balance within those societies? Very simple
Yes.
question.
So I would give a very cookie cutter economist view that there are certain industries where you know you need monopolies. Like there's some. That's why we talk about something called the natural monopoly, because there's certain industries where because of the economies of scale and the sunk costs, you need one company to um, um, provide that good. But but in general, I think yes, it's not just Muslim societies. Even the U.S., for example, has an anti-monopoly commission, and um, they try and fight those off. So you obviously need regulatory action to ensure that there are not enough restrictions. Uh, in fact, restrictions are a key part of the problem. That's why economies don't easily grow on their own, because at every end we have a restriction or we have an economic control which is benefiting someone. Because by closing off the market, you create rent streams for these insider groups. For sure, you need to think about you know opening up and for taking away the strangulation that has marred the market.
Barakallah fikum. I mean, there is also an explicit hadith in this connection, which is, لا يخت... لا يحتكر إلا خاطئا, أو كما قال, that um, no one who engages in monopolistic behavior, uh, no one engages in monopolistic behavior except a sinner. So it's a sinful act to do so, and these are ways in which the market's equilibrium is disturbed, and that's actually something which we find in the Quran and the Hadith as being something undesirable or even sinful, as we've just seen. I want to just perhaps bring proceedings to a close, and with thanking you, Adil, for really 2 hours of very broad, wide-ranging sort of conversation about Islamic economic integration, the challenges that we face in contemporary societies and Muslim societies globally. And also, you actually started this entire discussion looking back right to the beginning of the society in which the Prophet ﷺ was sent, and the impacts that his own message had, the economic dimensions of Islam, but also the economic dimensions that we often neglect in thinking about acts of worship, such as the Hajj. I'm very grateful to you for your time. I'd like to also thank the team behind the scenes for organizing this and letting it run so smoothly. And with that, I finally want to thank also the audience members who participated with lots of comments. We apologize to those of you who we couldn't get to your questions. There were a lot of questions and comments, but we thank you for your participation nonetheless, and we look forward to your joining in a month's time for the next colloquium. But with that, I'd like to conclude with a short prayer. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik. نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you very much.
جزاكم الله خيرا.